members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
While China struggled with its ancient traditions, Japan was dancing to a modern beat. In the cities, it was a time of bobbed hair and bathing beauties, of chorus lines and cabarets. Young people were consumed with being mobo and moga, modern boy and modern girl. People flocked to baseball games and newer entertainments like radio and Hollywood movies. Of course, modernization meant new problems, like rush hour. Or the mysteries of dining, Western style. But for many Japanese, the problem was modernization itself. Modernization had widened gaps between city and country. Farmers were at the mercy of international markets. If rice or silk prices fell in the West, farmers starved. For food, many families sold their daughters into prostitution. Many sons looked to military service as the only escape from a life of poverty and ignorance. In the factories, striking workers were demanding a bigger share of the profits. The big family-run corporations called zaibatsu used their power to keep wages low and profits high. Zaibatsu greed pushed many young Japanese far to the political left. But while the left looked forward to a workers' paradise, Japan's radical right wing looked back toward Japan's past. They saw national salvation in a return to the way of the samurai, a country ruled by the emperor and run by pure-hearted officials. They believed that Japan, in its headlong rush to imitate the West, was selling its national soul. In the early 1920s, most Japanese were caught between modern times and old traditions, embracing Western ideas while fearing the power of the West. Out of these conflicts emerged a radical young philosopher named Ikki. He began his life searching for a way to close the gap between Japan's rich and poor, and to inspire Asia to fight against foreign influences and Western imperialism.
Ikki reacted strongly against the westernization of Japan as he saw it. For him, the West was the enemy. Japan had to fight the battle of Asia against the West. That meant he was for a pan-Asian movement, so he went to China, as other Japanese of that day did. Kita went there right after Sun Yat-sen's rebellion in 1911.
Kita hoped to help the Chinese free themselves from Western domination. But he soon discovered that the Chinese didn't think of the Japanese as liberators. They saw Japan as just another imperialist, using military power to take commercial advantage of China.
Under my veranda were raging waves of crowds, insanely shouting their anger and hatred at my native land of Japan.
Kita returned home to try to save his country's soul. He retreated to Sado, a remote island in the Sea of Japan. On Sado, Kita found an ancient vision of Japan that shaped his own. In the 13th century, the Buddhist monk Nichiren blasted Japan's spiritual decadence and warned of imminent foreign invasion. The imperial government banished Nichiren to Sado Island, where his disciples still chant the Lotus Sutra. As a young man, Kita became a follower of Nichiren, in whose words Kita found a pure spirit of nationalism.
I will be the pillar of Japan. I will be the eyes of Japan. I will be the vessel of Japan.
Some would say he was a fanatic. He just plowed straight ahead like a medieval Buddhist. And since he was on cocaine, to some degree or another, most of the time, it probably colored the last 30 years of his life more than we know.
Kita took cocaine daily to ease the pain of a childhood eye injury. By the 1920s, he was attending seances, seeing ghosts, and entertaining visions of revolution. In 1920, he published his most famous book, A Plan for the Reconstruction of Japan. Much of it read like a leftist tract. It gave land to the farmers, profits to the workers, and broke the power of the Zaibatsu. But its inspiration came from a 19th century Japanese slogan, rich nation, strong military. Kita called for a military coup d'etat to re-establish the rule of the emperor. Then the army would drive out the European powers in the name of another slogan, Asia for the Asians.
After destroying England and freeing China, the rising sun flag of Japan will light the darkness of the entire world. Peace without war is not the way to heaven.
In the early 20s, Kita's book only reached a few people. But his radical ideas burned like a slow fuse in a country about to explode. On September 1st, 1923, Japan's main island of Honshu was struck by a devastating earthquake. In Tokyo, the quake started fires that destroyed 700,000 homes. 100,000 people died. The terrible damage shook urban society. In the chaos that followed, wild rumors spread that Koreans and Chinese had set the fires, and that socialists and communists were using the disorder to start riots. Communism preached that workers of the world must unite. But Kita thought that the problems of Japan's poor and homeless could only be solved by a Japanese solution. Nationalism, not international communism. In the late 1920s, Japan's government began to turn to the right, using a peace preservation law to crack down on the dangerous thought of socialists and communists, and to protect private property. In 1929, stock markets crashed all over the world. Huge fortunes were wiped out in a single day. A worldwide depression began. To the Japanese right, the Great Depression was proof that international capitalism was just as dangerous as international communism. To leave Japan's economy to the greed of individuals was a mistake. Kita Ikki believed that the Japanese people were kept poor by wealthy businessmen and politicians who stood between the people and the emperor. To destroy Japan's elites was the mission of military men, whom Kita saw as classless servants of the nation.
The Japanese soldier, samurai in the late feudal period, was a pure warrior who worked on behalf of the whole country. Translated to the modern scene, that meant that the properly trained warrior would continue to work for the whole country, not for himself.
Inspired by Kita Ikki, Japanese nationalists sought to mobilize the country by invoking ancient cultural myths of the emperor and the sword. Japan thought it needed what had made the Western powers strong, an empire. Dependent on resources and trade from China, Japan moved to annex the territory of Manchuria. The government gave Japanese farmers fertile Manchurian fields and full military protection. But the annexation of Manchuria did not solve Japan's problems. It deepened them. The exploitation of Chinese workers inflamed anti-Japanese feeling. The government and the big zaibatsu companies poured money into Manchuria but got very little out. When conditions did not improve in Japan, many people blamed the greed of wealthy business leaders. Poor young military officers, many of whom came from the countryside, began to talk about radical solutions to Japan's problems. For inspiration, they turned to the words of Kita Ikki.
The people are their main force, and the emperor their commander. Remove the barriers which have separated the people from the emperor.
Kita Ikki was a weird Japanese original. He was a populist, he was a socialist, he was also a fascist, he was an emperor worshiper, he was an anti-capitalist, but he was also anti-communist, and he thought that the hope for Japan lay in some kind of mysterious Japanese nationalization, the product of young people who were loyal to the emperor and who were against all these politicians who picked this idea up. Well, of course, it was the neo-fascist young officers of the 1930s.
At dawn on February 26, 1936, under cover of a snowstorm, 1,400 soldiers assembled to mount an assault on their own government. Rebel soldiers and tanks occupied the center of Tokyo and assassinated key government leaders. Following Kita's blueprint for revolution, they called on the rest of the military to take charge of the country in the name of the emperor. Soon after the attack, loyalist troops surrounded the rebels. The government declared martial law. For 4 days, Tokyo was under siege. During the attack, the rebels had telephoned Kita Ikki to tell him his vision of pure-hearted warriors saving a corrupt Japan was about to become reality. A recording of their conversation survives. The content of the phone call reveals little except that it took Kita completely by surprise. He was stunned that his book, an apocalyptic work of the imagination, had become a stark reality. The rebels had gambled on the emperor supporting their cause, but the emperor called them traitors. On February 29th, as loyalist troops prepared to open fire, the rebels surrendered. The February 26th rebellion gave Japan's pragmatic military leaders an excuse to do just what the rebels had proposed: take over the country from civilian politicians in the name of order and the emperor. "17 leaders of the revolt were executed. But most of those who revolted were not punished, only those with dangerous ideas. In 1937, Kita Ikki was caught in the prison of his own imagination.
The army decided they better put him away while they investigated this incident, and pretty soon they executed him for treason as a communist. Now here's a guy who had, even by that time, 1937, been referred to as a right-wing radical. Now the army declares that he's a closet communist and shoots him.
The army feared Kita's plans to share Japan's wealth, but they would soon learn the propaganda value of many of Kita's other ideas. It turned out that Kita would be worth far more dead than alive. After Kita's death, the military glorified military expansion as an anti-Western crusade. Asia for the Asians was the battle cry. With cruel irony, the military used Kita's pan-Asian ideas to liberate Asia.
Imagine a country that had just lost a world war that was imposed on her. Imagine this country being blamed for the entire war, with crushing reparations being placed on her in such a way that she is made economically enslaved to the victor nations. Imagine a period of reconstruction that throws the people of this country into a spiraling decline of poverty and cultural humiliation. Now imagine one man who rises to the occasion. Seeing all that has transpired, he inspires the downtrodden people to remember who they are and take on the struggle for a national rebirth. Imagine a man who wants to see his people united and strong again. Imagine a man with a character and leadership qualities that appeal to the broad masses in a peculiar and unprecedented way. Imagine a man who is known for his love of dogs. A man who has even the respect of his political opponents. A man who is known as a National Socialist. Oh, and this country isn't Germany, and the man being spoken of is not Adolf Hitler, but Inejiro Asanuma. Asanuma is probably a name most have not heard of. However, Asanuma is rather quite famous in Japan and other parts of Asia. In the West, Asanuma is viewed as a communist politician and is only known for suffering an assassination on live television by the hands of a 17-year-old reactionary by the name of Otoya Yamaguchi. The notion that Yamaguchi saved Japan from communism by assassinating Asanuma is a ridiculous myth that is objectively and demonstrably false. The origins of this narrative lie primarily in English sources and do not reflect the reality of that time in Japan. One of the biggest flaws in analyzing geopolitics after 1945 is the conflation of socialism and socialist ideas with communism as understood through the lens of Marxist-Leninism. It should be made clear, however, that after the end of the Second World War in 1945, third positionist ideas and movements could no longer associate themselves with the labels of fascism and Nazism without needlessly taking on a significant disadvantage in public perceptions. Perón, the leader of Argentina, is one example of this phenomenon. Thus, many thinkers and adherents of third positionist ideas began to associate and converge with the second positionists, i.e. Marxists and communists, in order to further engage in the struggle against international finance and world capitalism. Inejiro Asanuma was precisely an example of this post-war trend, sometimes described loosely as a National Socialist. Asanuma was the leader of the nationalist faction of the Japan Socialist Party. Much of what he did and thought were fragments from the imperial era of Japan. This will be his life and times laid out in a video. Born on the 27th of December 1898 in Miyake, Tokyo, Inejiro Asanuma started his political journey by joining the ultra-nationalist youth circles that emerged in Japan after World War I. He became a featured member in the circles of the Builders Alliance. Founded in 1919, the Builders Alliance was a representative student movement group during the Taisho democracy period. Soon afterwards, Asanuma joined the socialist movement and supported the nationwide peasant and labor disputes. Asanuma gave his own speech during a protest rally by a student group at the Waseda University of Military Research in which he advocated for cooperation with the military. As a result of this speech, he suffered beatings by ideologically opposed individuals that day. During the time of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, he participated in a rally in Gunma Prefecture and returned to Tokyo in a hurry. But when he was close to the building of the Farmers' Movement Company, he was arrested by a soldier and then detained in the Cavalry Regiment's storehouse. Soon after that, he was thrown into the Ichigaya prison. Similar to Adolf Hitler in Germany, Inejiro Asanuma argued that socialism went hand in hand with nationalism. Asanuma professed the idea that true socialism in Japan could not manifest without the framework of Japanese nationalism. These conclusions, without a doubt, derived from his great interest in reading the works of Japanese National Socialist thinker Ikki Kita. In 1923, Asanuma graduated from the Waseda University of Political Science and Economics and proceeded to completely dedicate his time to Japanese politics. In 1925, he co-founded the Farmer Laborist Party. This was a nationalist syndicalist party that was bound together with concepts such as class struggle. Asanuma was recommended by the General Secretary of the Farmer Labor Party, which was Japan's first proletarian party, at the young age of 26. However, the party was disbanded by government order only 1 hour after the party was officially formed. At the time, the government considered the party to be subversive to the imperial state. This setback did not deter Asanuma, however. In 1926, Asanuma formed a new party called the Laborist Farmer Party, which managed to develop its own theory of nationalist and anti-Marxist socialism. The party had the support of national syndicalist Nihon Hyogekai growing and gaining support mainly from Japan's farmers. By 1928, the party had over 90,000 members, but was sadly outlawed by the government that same year. This resulted in the former body resurfacing in the form of 3 factions: the Social Democratic Party, the Japan Labor Farmer Party, and the Labor Farmer Party. Asanuma became a member of the Japan Labor Farmer Party, which was the Social Nationalist faction. By 1932, Asanuma was being watched by the authorities as a result of being considered politically subversive to the imperial state, despite showing no clear signs of this. For example, he supported the state's decision in Manchuria in regard to China's aggressions. That same year, Asanuma founded the Social Party of the Masses, which advocated for a corporatist, nationalist, and military-based totalitarian model of statecraft. Asanuma endorsed a pamphlet published by the Army Ministry newspaper group in October of 1934, in Showa 9, called The True Meaning of National Defense and Its Proposal for Strengthening, or the Kokubo no Hongi Kyoka no Teisho in Japanese. The original drafts were prepared by Sumihisa Ikeda and Ryoji Shikata, who were dispatched students to the University of Tokyo, as well as Teiichi Suzuki from August 1933 to March 1934. After examination by the newspaper group led by Hiroshi Nemoto in March of 1934 to February of 1936, It was issued with the approval of the director of the Tetsuzan Nagata Military Affairs Bureau and got the approval of the Minister of the Army, Senjuro Hayashi. The content was more concrete than Ikki Kita's Japan Remodeling Bill outline. The content of the pamphlet was controversial because of its advocacy for the establishment of a corporatist state and the adoption of a planned economy led by the army. Hisashi Aso, the General Secretary of the Social Mass Party, enthusiastically praised it by saying, quote,
"Those who do not follow the pamphlet are the deceased of social reform activities," ending quote.
Asanuma later entered into conflict with Aso Hisashi, who had the idea of maintaining the monarchist system with the military sector as an auxiliary via an alliance. Asanuma disagreed with this approach, however. He considered Hisashi to be a conservative lacking in revolutionary spirit because he didn't support total socialization. However, in 1933, Asanuma would show himself as a fervent supporter of the military intervention in China and the necessary expansion of Japan due to the unfortunate developing geopolitical circumstances of the time. By now, it was becoming very clear that it was on the shoulders of the Japanese to expand their influence for the cause of securing both Japan and Asia against the exploitation and dangers posed by the ever-expanding capitalist imperialism through America and Britain. In 1933, Asanuma became a member of the City Hall of Tokyo. It was from this point on that Asanuma's popularity skyrocketed within the world of Japanese politics. In 1936, he became a member of the House of Representatives. In 1940, Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe founded the Taisei Yoku Sankai. The Prime Minister went on to name Asanuma as the Deputy Director of the Department of Investigations for Temporal Elections. When the Imperial Rule Assistance Association was established in 1940, he was appointed Deputy Director of the Extraordinary Electoral System Research Department. Later on in 1940, Asanuma, along with Takao Saito, criticized the attitude of the government and the military to continue the war effort in the manner it was conducted because it was a quagmire. Later on in 1940, his rival, Aso Hisashi, died of a heart attack, which led to Asanuma becoming the unopposed leader of his party. Asanuma became a member of the Uyoku Dantai, and went on to support Hideki Tojo against Konoe. Interestingly, Asanuma did not compete in the elections of 1942 because of his mental distress over his rival's death. This kept him sidelined from politics and subsequently meant that General Tojo was the only viable candidate at the time, thereby reaffirming the notion of him being the only man capable of leading Japan during the war. However, Asanuma did participate in the Metropolitan Conference of Tokyo as a candidate later on, getting elected as Vice President of Tokyo. Despite this success, Asanuma later failed in the attempt to modify the national constitution in accordance with his vision. After Japan had lost the war against America, Asanuma used to tell the tale of being in his apartment in Shenzhen when the surrender of Japan had taken place. He described listening to the emperor's speech as his most painful life experience and one of the few times in his life that he was brought to tears. On the 2nd of September 1945, Japan signed the peace treaty with the United States that concluded the war between the two countries. This event was a real time of humiliation for the Japanese people, Asanuma included. The Allies would go on to occupy Japan until 1952, with the Japanese people being totally subjugated to the United States. President Harry S. Truman made General Douglas MacArthur the supreme commander of the Allied forces. It was MacArthur's task to supervise the occupation of Japan. Soon after his entry into Tokyo by the 30th of August 1945, MacArthur essentially became dictator of Japan and proceeded to legislate laws under a new constitution. From 1945 to 1952, Japan suffered a large-scale dismantling of its military strength. At the same time, the US installed many occupational military facilities. During that period, Japan became a strategic point to fight communism in China, Vietnam, and Korea. A liberalization campaign of the country was conducted in both the economy and society. Asanuma knew that sooner or later, both the economy and society of Japan would become Americanized. Japan would open itself up to American deculturalization, which was embedded throughout the so-called civil liberties of the new constitution. This imposed constitution gave women the right to vote, abolished nobility, and most humiliating of all, turned the emperor into a mere symbol completely excluded from politics. The imperial house could no longer alter its own rules for succession without passing a law through an entity ruled by social contract. The American-written New Constitution of Japan utterly demolished imperial autonomy and spat on the age-old traditions of the Japanese. All of this was done against the will of the Japanese people, who bitterly protested in their hearts and thoughts, but were unable to freely express their discontent. In a very real sense, this was the downfall of Japanese civilization. Subjugated, humiliated, the spirits insulted, and divinity itself disrespected, Japan fell into a perpetual and never-ending 1945. For the first time ever, Freemasonry was allowed full influence in Japan. Up until that point, Japan had outlawed Freemasonry as subversive and dangerous. Likewise, the Japanese were not allowed to become Masons if they lived abroad in countries where Freemasonry was prevalent. American Freemasonry began to spread all over Japan after the 1950s. Masonic lodges sprang up all over the country, and the first generation of Japanese Freemasons were being initiated into the fraternity. The standardized vetting process for becoming a Freemason, as per usual with American Freemasonry, was conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, or FBI. To this very day, the Japanese people are largely unaware of how their current status as a vassal state of the United States has been engineered through the propagation of the network and influence of American Freemasonry in Japan. In the early years of this massive operation of American subversion, it was Inejiro Asanuma who stood tall and firm as the main leader against the Americanization of Japan. On the 2nd of November 1945, exactly 2 months before Japan's surrender, the Socialist Party of Japan was founded, with Asanuma becoming third in line for the leadership of the party behind Kawakami Kutaro and Miwa Masanori, who were old acquaintances of Asanuma from the nationalist activist days. In 1947, the general secretary of the party, the radical Suehiro Nishio, was replaced by Tetsu Kateyama, a reformist. Katayama wanted to cooperate with the Americans and abandoned the party's platform of fighting against the occupation of the country and for the taking back of Japan's national independence. Katayama was re-elected as prime minister later that year, a position he maintained until March of 1948. During that year, Katayama's government became servile to the interests of the occupiers, collaborating heavily with General MacArthur, who was sometimes called the American Caesar. This caused the anger of many in the factions of the party, including Asanuma himself. He repeatedly attacked Katayama and accused him of being a sellout and a traitor to Japan. Asanuma quickly rose to become the main voice of the nationalists. Like many others in the party, he considered the occupation as nothing but humiliating and unworthy of the Japanese people. The Americanization of Japan was viewed as the greatest danger to the country, and consequently the most important recourse was the advocacy for the reclamation of sovereignty by the total expulsion of all American influence out of Asia. When Tetsu Katayama, the chairman of the House of Representatives, was defeated in the 24th House of Representatives general election in 1949, the Socialist Party voted Asanuma for the nomination. In 1949, Katayama failed his re-election and Asanuma became the general secretary of the Japanese Socialist Party. After this, Asanuma's name fell on the US's blacklist and he essentially became Washington, D.C.'s #1 enemy in Japan. In 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Japan-US Security Treaty were formalized. Asanuma was outraged by the result, believing America would now have cultural, economic, and political control over Japanese society indefinitely. That same year, Asanuma held a meeting in which both far-left and radical nationalists united in solidarity against American occupation. They also denounced the Liberal Democrat Party as anti-patriotic and as an instrument of international capitalism to subordinate the will of the Japanese people to the guidelines of Washington and Wall Street, New York. The Constitution of Japan after World War II was not written by the Japanese people, but by the Americans, causing outrage by many. The Japanese Socialist Party opposed it, while many branches of the so-called nationalist and right-wing factions were in favor of it. After that, Asanuma became the general secretary of the party, spared no time nor sleep, and rallied support for his comrades all over the country. It was during this time that Asanuma was given the nickname of the human locomotive in respect to his immense vitality and drive. Polarization of the right-wing radicals of the party and the reformist line of the other inevitably led to the progressive disintegration of the party as a whole. Since Asanuma could not stop the division, he started to combat the reformist line of the party and diminishing its influence. Asanuma became frustrated with his comrades and accused the party of being full of sellouts and capitalists. He denounced his companions as, quote,
being asleep while the capitalists devour our homeland. Ending quote.
Asanuma also showed himself to be an ardent anti-communist. For example, he accused the Soviet Union of being just as imperialistic as America in that it wanted to subordinate all of the other nations around its orbit. He further accused the communists of being just as anti-patriotic as the capitalists. Poetically, this would lead many communists to accuse Asanuma of being a fascist. Asanuma was also an enthusiastic supporter of the non-aligned movement, praising leaders such as Nasser and Sukarno. According to him, the destiny of Japan was to non-align itself to any superpower, because this would be the only way in which Japan could establish its own sovereignty. Asanuma pointed at Sukarno as a model to follow for the new Japanese nation. When the Japanese Socialist Party was reunited in 1955, Asanuma became General Secretary. This time, he tried to have a greater internal unity in the party. Asanuma again incorporated the project of his past, a form of Japanese National Socialism. Asanuma also embraced Pan-Asianism around this time as the most realistic path to breaking Asia free from the American chains of international capitalism. He affirmed once again the destiny of the Japanese nation to lead the charge for a great Asia Union and the expulsion of the American neo-colonists from Asia. His latest program included the following tenets: the expulsion of all Anglo-American capitalist and liberal influence, the reclamation of full national sovereignty, the abolition of liberal democracy, the establishment of a great Pan-Asian Union, anti-imperialism, the abolition of interest slavery, economic socialization through corporatism, anti-Semitism and anti-Masonry, anti-communism, a reorganized government with military leadership, and the restoration of total imperial authority. During this decade, Asanuma was known for his meetings and appearances on many television programs where he talked about how the United States wanted to destroy the Japanese identity and the importance of combating imperialism in Asia by defeating international capitalism. During these years, he gained media antagonism, being sometimes ridiculed by the media and even falsely accused of being a communist. Takeo Fukuda, one of the heads of the Liberal Democrat Party, would have a direct confrontation with him. Asanuma accused Fukuda of being an asset for the CIA, while Fukuda accused Asanuma of being insane. Asanuma was convinced that since the outbreak of the war in China in the 1930s, that his country, Japan, was in the hands of a great international conspiracy no different than Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy had been by the forces of international capitalism and liberalism. In 1959, the Sino-Soviet rupture happened. Asanuma was happy about this fact and praised the Chinese government for its decision to break free of the Soviet orbit and regain its sovereignty as a free and independent nation. Despite his opposition to Marxism, Asanuma praised Mao and called him, quote,
a great Asian patriot who defended his fatherland from imperialism, whether American or Soviet, ending quote.
What happened one morning? One at a time, how in Chinese?
One morning, the author and his wife came down to breakfast.
You'll get from the report, from the article.
Goods are of poor quality, and the service there is also bad.
The services are intolerable. The services are intolerable. Now, what are Soviet goods so poorly made, and why are their services so bad?
Has degenerated social imperialist.
The Soviet Union, under the Brezhnev rule of the revisionist clique, has degenerated into what? Yes, has degenerated into a social imperialist country.
What do you think of the Russians? Are the Russians really so bad?
Yes, I think the Soviet Union is very bad. under rule of the Brezhnev clique. Because I think the Soviet Union is no longer a socialist country. It has degenerated into the social imperialist country.
The play, performed so perfectly by the boys of a Peking commune, symbolizes China's defense against an enemy. The enemy is that other vast communist powerhouse, the Soviet Union. While both nations tread a communist path, their characters are very different. While Russian communism has been based on the struggle of the industrial working classes, China's grew from a peasant resistance movement. China claims that Russian communism aims at aggression and domination, while it seeks only classless equality for its people. Even to the outsider, it's a difference that's not difficult to pin down. The roots of Chinese communism lie in the soil. Strong emphasis on efficient, productive agriculture, primitive though it remains, has helped shape the kind of doctrine which guides the people. The Soviet Union is far behind China in food production, but stronger in industry. That industrial society has bred an unspoken hierarchy: managers, skilled workers, laborers. But here in China, everyone must sometime till the soil, and that way, it's claimed, everyone has a common class.
In 1959, Asanuma visited China and met up with Mao Zedong and other senior leaders. He quickly grew enthusiastic about the idea of a Sino-Japanese alliance against America. On the 12th of March 1959, Asanuma gave a speech in China called "United States Imperialism is a Mutual Enemy Between Japan and China." Quoting a short section from the speech, one can understand his rationale. Quote, "I don't think there is a conflict between classes. Also, I don't think it's a race and a race that bleeds. I think that human beings are the ones who solve these problems as soon as possible and mobilize all their strengths to struggle with nature. This struggle cannot be done without the practice of socialism. China has now settled all contradictions and is concentrating on nature. Here you can think of the progress of the socialist state. I pray for victory in this struggle. We, the Japanese Socialist Party, also struggled with capitalism and struggle with imperialism in Japan to overcome the contradictions of capitalism and imperialism, resolve domestic contradictions, and then resolve all contradictions." End quote. Asanuma entertained the idea that with the friendship of the Chinese, one could better resist the USA. That American imperialism, the enemy of China, Japan, and all of Asia at large, could finally be crushed. His visit, his speeches, and his remarks caused immense controversy among many groups within Japanese society. Logically, it makes sense for Asanuma to look to Maoist China for geopolitical realignment, given that they were the most powerful anti-American force in the region. Asanuma said the following about Maoist China.
Beginning quote, "American imperialism is a common enemy to both the Japanese and Chinese people." Ending quote.
Furthermore, Asanuma praised Kim Il-sung, who in his view abandoned Marxism. Asanuma became enthusiastic about the idea of a socialist and nationalist Far East led by himself, Mao, Kim, and Sukarno. These ideas only made internal opposition against him grow. His companions named him a charlatan and called him insane. Trying to break away from Asanuma, Suehiro Nishio and others retired from the Japanese Socialist Party and founded the Socialist Democrat Party. Chairman Suzuki also resigned, and Asanuma was elected as the successor to Suzuki. Asanuma fought with the security struggle in the foreground and forced the cabinet of Nobusuke Kishi to resign, but he could not win the abolition of the Security Treaty. Between 1959 and 1960, a phenomena in Japan was produced against the government of Nobusuke Kishi close to the 1960 elections. Students, workers, and citizens went into the streets in an anti-American movement in which Asanuma became one of the main figureheads.
No doubt about it, most Tokyo people do not want the new security treaty between Japan and America. Outside Parliament, they demonstrated against it, hoping to stop the government ratifying the treaty. It gives the U.S. bases 10 more years to stay in Japan. Outside, it was a riot. Inside the House of Representatives, a super riot. Opposition members were determined to hold up the session, so the government summoned 500 police. Not exactly an advertisement for democracy, but amusing enough for the onlooker. The Japs say the treaty might land them in a war they don't want, just as Japan a few years ago hurled a lot of countries into a war they didn't want. The main thing for the government was to get the speaker to his chair so that business could begin. And get him they would, dead or alive. Mr. Speaker finally made it, and the government majority got the treaty ratified. They certainly owe thanks to that poor speaker. Since we received these pictures, there have been more riots. When they get excited, the Japs get pretty excited, don't they?
Asanuma's popularity in downtown Tokyo was so enormous at this time that a newspaper reporter who spoke badly about Asanuma was knocked out of the cafeteria where the local workers had gathered. With his advanced oratory skills, he won the support of workers and students that were protesting in the streets. Despite the internal opposition, Asanuma announced his candidacy for the next election that would take place in November later that year. Sometime after, documents would prove that the authorities took Asanuma seriously and watched his every move, just like the FBI does in the United States with dissidents today. On October 12th, just 1 month before the elections, Asanuma participated in a debate in the Japanese parliament against the leader of the Democratic Liberal Party, Hayato Ikeda. This debate was being watched by roughly 2,500 people and televised live via the NHK. Asanuma started his speech by addressing the defense of sovereignty when suddenly he was surprised by an onrushing teenager with a short sword who jumped onto the stage rapidly and stabbed Asanuma twice in the chest in front of thousands of people on live television. Asanuma was left mortally wounded and was rushed to the hospital. Sadly, he did not survive his injuries and died aged 61 years old. The assassin was Otoya Yamaguchi, a 17-year-old member of the Uyoku Dantai, connected to the Great Japan Patriotic Party, a monarchist and traditionalist group. He had somehow managed to evade security, armed with a sword to kill Asanuma. The Great Japan Patriotic Party, which was one of the right-wing groups run by Bin Akao connected to the Uyoku Dantai, sensationally and liberally accused many people of being communists or wanting to destroy the old system in favor of another system. They falsely accused Asanuma of wanting to do this. It is important to note that the Great Japan Patriotic Party, the party that Yamaguchi was connected to, had been pro-Anglo-American since the 1920s, and that right-wingers saw all types of socialism to be detrimental to the Japanese national body regardless of nuances. Another important thing to note is that the Yakuza were generally aligned with this group and were utilized by Americans and the ruling Japanese party, the Liberal Democratic Party, in racketeering or assassinations against protesters and anyone anti-American in general. When Yamaguchi was arrested, nothing could be extracted from the interrogations, and 3 weeks later he was found dead in his cell, hanged by his own sheets in an apparent suicide. "Would that I had 7 lives to give for my country," and "Long live His Majesty the Emperor," were found written in his jail cell. What is often not mentioned, however, is the fact that Japanese government documents reveal that Otoya Yamaguchi also had 2 shotgun bullets in the back of his head.
Inejiro Asanuma was fondly known as an ardent dog lover and enjoyed Disney animations that had dogs in them. Asanuma himself had a dog that died, which saddened him dearly. His political opponent, Kenji Fukunaga, chairman of the Liberal Democratic Party's National Assembly Countermeasures Committee, and Kazuyuki Kasuga, the chairman of the Democratic Socialist Party's National Assembly Countermeasures Committee, presented Asanuma an Akita dog to help cheer him up. Asanuma was enamored by the dog. He named it Jiro. Locals who lived near his apartment often remarked how Asanuma would walk his dog, Jiro, every morning with a great smile on his face. How well trained and happy Jiro was by his master's side. It was said that after the assassination, Jiro refused to eat because Asanuma wasn't in the house anymore. Asanuma's wife, who was now a widow, remarked how Jiro would patiently wait every single day for his master to return. Locals reported seeing the dog sitting in the same location, looking out into the distance, as if he was convinced that his master would be walking towards him at any moment. Jiro became depressed and began to starve as a result of refusing to eat.
1年になんかたまに夜中に起きて思うんだ。バカはどうしてるんだろうって。だからよくお前の気持ちわかる。バカはもう帰ってこないんだよ。ここで待ちたいなら待てばいい。そうしたいんだろう。
もうどれくらい時が経ったかな。雨の日も風の日も僕はあなたの帰りを待ち続けてる。知らない人の土星や怪我をしたけどへっちゃらだよ。それであなたに会えるのなら怖くないから、いつまでもあなたを待ってる。今日の日も夕暮れに染まったけど、あなたの姿はなくて、列車の音また期待して僕は尾を振りながら浅い眠りについたよ。夢を見たよ すよもうどれくらい時が経ったかな春も夏も秋も冬の日も季節の旅あなたに会えぬまま優しい人の思いもすり抜けてここでずっと待ってるそれであなたに会えるのなら
Despite his deteriorating health, he always gave the impression that he had an unyielding hope to one day see Asanuma return. But that day never came. Jiro passed away waiting for his master, who never returned.
The most important aspect in understanding Asanuma as a person and as a political figure is that he never renounced any of his actions in the past. This means he never let go of his nationalistic patriotism. Similarly, he never renounced his reverence for his imperial majesty, nor his past as a member of the Yokusenkai. Yamaguchi died a child soldier of the Uyoku Dentai, a zealot in American hands. The actions that Yamaguchi took shook the entire country to its core, and inspired many right-wingers at the time because such a direct and public political action had not taken place since the February 26th incident in 1936. Asanuma was a nationalist and revered the emperor to the very end of his life. In this tragic manner, one can view Yamaguchi and Asanuma as fellow patriots who were torn apart by differing political views. The most pressing matter of the Cold War was divided between a stance in favor of the USA, a stance in favor of the Soviet Union, or a stance of neutrality. This was where Asanuma and Yamaguchi ultimately differed. A strong political disagreement in respect to which entity they thought was most harmful to the Japanese body politique and to his imperial majesty. Asanuma saw the American occupation as more harmful, while Yamaguchi saw China and Korea as the greater threat. These days, most people in the contemporary Japanese nationalist sphere generally agree that both Asanuma and Yamaguchi were morally upright people who held true to their principles and convictions. The assassination itself is controversial to this day. The consequences of Yamaguchi's actions and the validity of the reasoning behind his motivation to kill, however pure his heart may have been, utterly doomed Japan in the long run considering Asanuma's prominence and the potential for a pro-Japanese sovereignty movement. The stance that Asanuma took at the time was that Japan should be geopolitically independent and thus free from American servility. The consequence of Asanuma's assassination was the castration of any pro-Japanese sovereignty movement. If one wishes to prioritize Japanese geopolitical and imperial sovereignty, one would think that Asanuma's National Socialism, combined with anti-liberalism, was the most appropriate theoretical and practical orientation for the Cold War. Given how corrosive the US occupation of the home islands was to the national body politique, and how servile Japan had become since then, Yamaguchi's misguided, valorous final act is in fact an utter tragedy for the Japanese people and for Japanese civilization. It can only be described as an act of spiritual suicide for the nation of Japan. One patriot deemed it necessary to assassinate another patriot even though they both desired the same fundamental future for Japan and revered the emperor to the end of their lives. After such a tragic state of affairs, there can only be lamentation for the death of a patriot, almost as if a member of the family killed their own kin.
Japan ballots to elect 467 legislators and a new government under the nation's parliamentary system. The election was conducted with relative calm, despite fears raised by the left-wing riots of last spring and the recent assassination of Socialist chief Asanuma. A clear mandate was sought by Premier Ikki Kita's conservative regime for its pro-American policies, and the returns gave Ikeda a solid majority, although both socialists and communists gained strength at the expense of splinter parties. Mr. Ikeda seems to have won his mandate.
In a speech given on October 12th of 1960, Inejiro Asanuma stated, quote,
"My comrades, I think the essence of politics is to straighten the crooked things of the national society, to correct the wrong things, and to bring the unnatural things back to their natural form. However, there are many bent, fraudulent, and unnatural things in our country today." Ending quote.
「帝国の流体、東亜の腐敗、まさにこの一戦にあり、両国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。勝利は常にニーズのもとにありと確信いたすものであります。我らは未だかつて戦いに敗れたことを知りません。